He was hit before he ever touched France. On the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, a 21-year-old American medic named Waverly Woodson was still several hundred yards off Omaha Beach, standing in a crowded landing craft, when the vessel was torn open beneath him and shrapnel went into his back and into his groin. The man beside him was killed. Woodson was badly wounded, in the water, off the deadliest beach of the invasion, before the ramp had even gone down. What he did over the next 30 hours, while bleeding on that sand under the German guns on the bluffs above him, is one of the most extraordinary individual performances of the entire Second World War, and for 80 years, almost nobody knew his name. Woodson described that approach himself 50 years later, and his words are worth hearing exactly as he said them. "The tide brought us in," he told an interviewer in 1994, "and that's when the 88s hit us." He meant the German 88mm guns firing down from the bluffs. "They were murder," he said. Of the Navy personnel aboard his craft, he said only one was left. The fire raked the whole top of the vessel, and then, he said, they started with the mortar shells. That is the situation Waverly Woodson was wounded into, an enemy sitting on high ground with the beach ranged and registered, and nothing on that sand to hide behind. He got ashore. Somebody patched his wounds enough to stop the worst of the bleeding, and Corporal Woodson, a combat medic, the man whose entire job was other people, looked at the beach around him. Omaha on that morning was the worst place in the American war. The first waves had been shot to pieces coming out of the water. The sand and the shingle were covered with men who needed help immediately, and were not going to get it, because there were nowhere near enough medics, and the ones there were kept getting hit. Woodson was hurt, and he was entitled to be a casualty. Instead, he set up an aid station on the beach and started working. He worked for 30 hours, not 30 minutes, not a hard morning, 30 consecutive hours, through the whole of D-Day, through the night that followed, and into the next day, on an open beach under artillery and small arms fire, while his own untreated wounds kept bleeding. In that time, by the Army's own account, he treated an estimated 200 men. He set broken limbs. He stopped bleeding and gave plasma and transfused blood. He performed an amputation on a soldier's foot in the sand. We are not going to describe any of that in detail, and we do not need to. The number is the point. One wounded 21-year-old, 200 men, 30 hours, under the guns. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like, and stay with us all the way to the end. To understand what those 30 hours actually asked of him, you have to picture the geography. Omaha Beach is a crescent of sand backed by steep bluffs 150 feet high, and on that morning the Germans were on top of those bluffs, in concrete, looking straight down. Everything on the sand was visible to them and within range. There was no cover worth the name. A medic cannot do his job lying flat. He has to be upright, moving from man to man, kneeling in the open, staying still long enough to work. Woodson spent a day and a night doing precisely the thing that gets a man killed on a beach like that, in full view of an enemy who could not miss, and the Germans above Omaha Beach never managed to stop him. He was not entirely alone. There were other medics on that beach, and the record is clear that the men of his unit as a whole performed extraordinarily, but the volume of work that came through Woodson's hands was exceptional even by the standards of that day. Men were brought to him and dragged to him and washed up to him. He triaged them, treated what he could, and got them moved, and all through it he was steadily weakening, because the shrapnel in his back and groin had not been properly dealt with, and he was still losing blood the entire time. He simply kept going, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping meant the next man got nothing. He collapsed at the end of it. After roughly 30 hours, Waverly Woodson finally went down on that beach, from his injuries, from the pain, and from the blood he had been losing since before he landed, and he was carried off and evacuated to a hospital ship offshore. By any reasonable measure, that is where the story ends. A wounded man had done 30 hours of impossible work, and was finally, mercifully, finished, except that it is not where the story ends. Because on his way off that beach, barely conscious, Waverly Woodson saw something in the water. What he saw was men drowning, British soldiers in the surf going under, and Waverly Woodson, who had been wounded before he landed, who had just worked 30 consecutive hours under fire, who was at that moment being evacuated because his own body had quit on him, went back into the water. He pulled 3 drowning men out of the sea and resuscitated them. 3 more lives, after he had already collapsed, after he had already given everything a person can reasonably be asked to give, and then finally he let them take him to the ship. At first he was recognized, loudly. When word of what Woodson had done on Omaha Beach reached the United States, the black press seized on it and made him famous. Newspapers hailed him as the #1 invasion hero. It was not only the black papers. Stars and Stripes, the U.S. military's own newspaper, wrote that Woodson and his fellow medics had covered themselves with glory on D-Day. The Army itself put out a news release in August 1944 describing him as a soldier cited by his commanding officer for extraordinary bravery. For a moment in the summer of 1944, Corporal Waverly Woodson of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was one of the most celebrated enlisted men in the American Army. What went wrong is the part that has taken 80 years to unpick. The records of the period indicate that Woodson's commanding officer intended to recommend him for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. That recommendation went into the machinery of the United States Army in 1944 and never came out. There was no ceremony, no citation, no decision anyone can point to. It simply did not happen. What Waverly Woodson received instead, for 30 hours on Omaha Beach, was a Bronze Star, and that is where his official recognition sat, essentially untouched, for the rest of his life. Why it vanished is not really a mystery, and it is worth stating plainly rather than dancing around it. Roughly 1.2 million black Americans served in the armed forces of the United States in the Second World War. Not one of them received the Medal of Honor during the war or in the years immediately after it. Not one. That is not a statistical accident. It is a fact about the country and the army of that time, and it was only addressed decades later, in the 1990s, when a formal review led to a small number of black veterans of that war finally receiving the Medal of Honor, most of them by then posthumously. Waverly Woodson was not among them, and Woodson himself went home and got on with a life. He left the Army, studied medical technology, and spent 28 years working at the Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, and at the National Institutes of Health, a man who had spent the worst day of the century keeping people alive, spending the rest of his work life in medicine. But to understand both what he did on that beach and why the recognition never came, you have to know something about the unit he was in and why a few hundred black soldiers were on Omaha Beach at all on the morning of the 6th of June, because that story has been almost entirely forgotten too. Before we widen the lens, sit for a moment with what that silence actually cost, because it is the quiet tragedy underneath the heroism. If this is the kind of history you want kept alive, subscribe. Stories like this one survive only because people keep telling them. Waverly Woodson lived until 2005. He was 82 years old when he died. For 61 years after Omaha Beach, he lived as a private American citizen with a Bronze Star in a drawer, while the specific thing he had done, 30 hours, 200 men, 3 more pulled out of the sea, sat unrecognized at the level it deserved. Somebody did fight for him, his wife. Joanne Woodson spent years pressing for her husband's service to be properly recognized, and in 2015 she went to her senator in Maryland for help, beginning a campaign that would outlast her husband by 2 decades. And on the other side of it, inside the Army itself, a historian at First Army named Kevin Braflat spent hundreds of hours going through the records, hunting for the documentary evidence that would prove what everyone who had been on that beach already knew. Between a widow who would not let it go and an Army historian who kept digging, the case for Waverly Woodson was slowly, painstakingly rebuilt from paper. They won a great deal. In 2023, at his graveside in Arlington National Cemetery, Waverly Woodson was posthumously awarded the Combat Medic Badge and the Bronze Star that the paperwork had never properly caught up with. And then, in September 2024, at a ceremony in Washington, the United States Army posthumously awarded Corporal Waverly B. Woodson Jr. the Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest decoration for valor, one step below the Medal of Honor. His widow Joanne, then 95 years old, and their son Steve accepted it. He would have felt honored to be recognized for what he knew was his duty, Joanne Woodson said, but we all know it was far more than duty. The Medal of Honor is still unresolved, and we will come back to exactly where that stands, because it is an honest and complicated question rather than a simple one. But first, the promised step back. To understand why Waverly Woodson was on that beach, and why the unit he served in has been so thoroughly forgotten that most people who know D-Day well have never heard of it, we have to go back to a young man from Pennsylvania, to a strange and now obsolete piece of military technology, and to the segregated United States Army of 1944. Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. was born in 1922 and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in a family that valued education. He was studying at a historically black college with the intention of becoming a doctor when the war reached him. He came from a family that served. His brother would go on to fly with the Tuskegee Airmen, the celebrated black fighter pilots of the Army Air Forces. Waverly was drafted, and he wanted to be an officer, and the segregated army of the early 1940s had other ideas about how far a black soldier would be permitted to go. What he was permitted to be was a medic. Given his ambitions in medicine, it was at least work he understood, and it would turn out to matter enormously. The unit he was assigned to was the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, and its job is one of the strangest and most completely forgotten missions of D-Day. Barrage balloons were large, unmanned, hydrogen-filled balloons flown on steel cables above a position. They carried no guns and shot at nothing. Their entire purpose was the cable, an enemy aircraft trying to come in low and fast over the beachhead, to strafe the landing craft, to bomb the men on the sand, risked flying into a steel tether it could not see. The balloons forced German pilots to stay high, where they were far less accurate and far more exposed to anti-aircraft fire. On the most crowded, most vulnerable stretch of coastline in the war, the 320th balloons were an invisible roof over the invasion, and the men flying them were black. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, roughly 1,700 soldiers, was the only all-black combat unit to land on Omaha Beach on D-Day, and one of the very few black combat units in the invasion at all. Around 2,000 African-American servicemen are believed to have taken part in the Normandy landings, out of an invasion force of well over 100,000. They served in an army that was segregated by regulation, separate units, separate quarters, white officers, and a pervasive official assumption that black soldiers were suited to labor and support rather than to fighting. The men of the 320th went ashore in the first waves at Omaha under that assumption, and proceeded to disprove it in the most public way available. And when it was over, the 320th was sent home to a base in Georgia, where, on arrival, the men who had landed on Omaha Beach were met by white American soldiers who greeted them with racial abuse. The unit was later shipped out to Hawaii, where it spent the rest of the war. That is the context for everything in this story. A battalion that had gone ashore in the first waves at Omaha, coming home to a country that had not changed at all, and a medic whose commander wanted to put him up for the Medal of Honor, watching that recommendation quietly evaporate. Knowing all of that does not make what Waverly Woodson did on the 6th of June smaller, it makes it very much larger. No, here is where the Medal of Honor question actually stands, stated honestly, because it deserves better than a slogan. Woodson's family, Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, members of Congress, and the historians at First Army have argued for years that Waverly Woodson earned the Medal of Honor on Omaha Beach and was denied it because of his race. The United States Army has responded that the surviving documentation from 1944 is not sufficient to support a retroactive award, that too many of the original records are simply gone. Both of those things can be true at once. A recommendation that vanished 80 years ago leaves a thin paper trail, and the reason it vanished is precisely the injustice people are trying to correct. The campaign continues. What he has received in the end is real. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, Waverly Woodson went back to Normandy and received France's highest honor, the Legion of Honor. In 2023 came the Combat Medic Badge and the Bronze Star at his grave in Arlington. In 2024 came the Distinguished Service Cross, and then First Army did something that says more than any citation. Soldiers from Woodson's own former command carried that medal to France, and on Omaha Beach, in a small ceremony, they laid the Distinguished Service Cross down on the sand where a 21-year-old corporal had come ashore, bleeding, 80 years before, and had refused to stop working for 30 hours. Corporal Waverly B. Woodson Jr. of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, medic of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, was wounded before he reached Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, 1944, and then treated an estimated 200 men over 30 hours under German fire, collapsed and got back into the sea to pull out 3 more. He went home to a country that gave him a Bronze Star and not much else, worked 28 years in medicine, and died in 2005 at the age of 82. His widow Joanne spent the rest of her life fighting for him. Somewhere out there are the children and grandchildren of 200 men who came off that beach alive because a wounded 21-year-old would not lie down. The Germans on the bluffs above Omaha Beach had every advantage there was: height, concrete, artillery, and a beach with nothing on it to hide behind. For 30 hours they fired down onto that sand, and the one thing they could not do was stop a wounded medic from kneeling in the open and saving the next man. His own could not quite bring itself to give him the medal for it. But 200 families exist because of what he did, and no committee anywhere ever had the power to take that away. People still argue about the Medal of Honor question, whether the missing paperwork should be decisive 80 years on, or whether the reason it is missing is itself the argument. Maybe you have a view. And there were around 2,000 African-American servicemen at Normandy whose stories have gone almost entirely untold. If your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, anyone in your family served with the 320th, or landed at Normandy, or served as a medic or a corpsman anywhere, in any branch and any role, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did or said, or one thing you remember. The men history overlooked deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.